I should probably start by saying that it does say I'm in the Department for Computer Science at Warwick, but my background's actually in sort of social science and human geography, which will probably reflect quite strongly on this talk as well. So I'm bringing a more humanistic side of the arguments to the table. And so, yeah, my talk today is actually just on my PhD research as well. So at the end, I would welcome any sort of feedback or suggestions in any directions as well. So to start off with, it's probably best to start with a story, which introduces my research quite well. So in 1906, a statistician named Francis Galton attended a country fair in Plymouth. And he became interested in a competition where members of the public were asked to guess the weight of an ox. He was interested in this because he was interested in how the public vote, and he had the belief that the public weren't very capable of achieving very much in terms of the vote itself. So he collated all 800 of the results, and he observed the mean guess of 1,197 pounds. Does anyone want to guess what the actual weight of the ox was? Someone said it right there. It would have been perfect if it was a spot on, but yeah, the result was 1,198 pounds. So interestingly, the collective result was actually better than the winning guess of this competition as well, to the surprise of Galton and hopefully not to the surprise of us as well. So this leads me to my first kernel of research, which is on collective intelligence. It's this idea of the wisdom of the crowds. And it was discussed, presented in a brilliant fashion earlier, so I won't go into too much detail. But just to recap, it's this group intelligence that emerges from collaborative efforts. And this relates actually quite well to my second point, which is on the age-old debate of the true level of participation in democracy. So as I'm sure we're all aware, at the moment we sit in a representative model where officials are elected who best represent our opinions. And this was traditionally seen as the best technical solution due to the large geographical distances which plagued us. However, many people argue at the moment that this model is now outdated, so the representative vote itself is a molar process of social regulation where the citizen's identity is just reduced to a binary statistic or yes or no to answer a set or a predefined set of questions itself. And so if we're electing a representative or a single representative, we're effectively blocking out the ability for a collective intelligence to emerge from a group. And so that leads on to my next point, or my next kernel, which is a move towards direct democracy. So this is, instead of a representative vote, it's where citizens are more directly involved in the decision-making process, something that we've talked about before. And we're seeing this more and more today. So, for example, the Citizen Assembly. There's one happening at the moment on climate change, I think, as well. So there's a lot of positive points to the Citizen Assembly, and I won't go into them now, but I'm afraid I'm going to be quite pessimistic and say there's still some underlying issues that occur on these offline tools. So, for example, within the Citizen Assembly itself, we have an issue of representation, for example. If the assembly is held in a particular geographical location, that will already block out 90% of the population who aren't able to attend. Or if it's held over a certain day, for example, there'll be a number of citizens that aren't able to attend the assembly due to work commitments or other issues as well. And so this brings on to my third and final kernel of research, which is for governments to embrace the pervasive influence of information and communication technologies. Something that they haven't actually done in the past. And this has developed a gap between the activities of citizens and the way in which democracy is carried out, which has caused an increase in mistrust in the government. And so my research sits in the tiny middle part as well. So I'm interested in these online platforms of participation at a city level. And we've had some excellent examples. And so I'm looking at the case studies. So Better Reykjavik in Iceland is one of them. Madame Mayor, I Have an Idea in Paris, and Decide Madrid in Spain. So I'm basically investigating whether these platforms are successful in providing a form of online participation or not. If they are successful, what attributes can we take from them and replicate elsewhere? And if they're not successful, what redesigns can be made so we can create a sustainable model of online participation? And although fairly early on in my research, I've identified a few key underlying issues that are cropped up among a lot of these platforms themselves. And I should mention, some of these issues were pre-enhancement of the Consul platform as well. So the first issue is resources. So as mentioned before, it's these platforms were set up to reduce the administrative burden and decision-making on city officials. Yet the sheer number of proposals that come in still have to be checked by the city officials themselves, which places a strain on this resource, but also on IT systems as well, who are have the intake of the proposals themselves. And of course, money as well. There's an issue where it takes money to set up the platforms themselves, but it also takes money to maintain engagement within the platform. The second issue is visibility. So as we discussed before, and this has gone into detail in the earlier session today, so these platforms receive a large number of proposals from super users, and this can create, again, a strain on the IT systems. And it also leads to duplication, so the proposals are replicated, and that will spread the votes thin. So how can we identify proposals of interest? The third issue is how to generate better ideas to tackle the more complex or pressing issues of the city itself. So how do we engage with the collective intelligence of the crowd to tackle the more social, economic pressing problems? So some of the issues or proposals raised can be quite small scale or localized. It's how to direct members of the public to tackle the more pressing issues. And the final one is participation. So I think this is the biggest one as well. So obviously raising awareness of these platforms remains a challenge. Despite a large number of proposals, they're still covered by these super users, which don't cover the whole population. And the reasons for lack of participation vary. They could be lack of time, lack of interest, something called the participation dilemma, which means that you sit back and hope that someone else will deal with the problem for you. It could be online access. And on top of this, in numbers participation, we also have the issue of diverse participation as well. I think it was mentioned earlier in another comment as well. Oh, she's come up on my screen as well. So we have the issue of diverse participation. So the Citizens Foundation, who helped set up Better Reykjavik, ran a brief survey on their users, and they found that it was mostly directed towards high university educated, middle-aged men, which is obviously an issue when you're trying to increase the representation. So although very brief and a brief cover of these issues, I feel that although offering a form of direct democracy, they're not utilising the crowd's collective intelligence correctly. The platforms need to be a space for collective intelligence, and they need to take place in a collective and intersubjective way, so that the debates need to be open and diverse. And these sort of elements lean towards a more deliberative state. So I believe that the platform should lean towards a more enhanced democracy. And so the question then is, like, can this occur? Particularly, can this occur online as well? And so I think it can, following, for example, we've got Jürgen Habermas's public sphere theory. So just to define the sphere, it's an idealistic site for open and equal deliberation between all members of society. So Habermas states that this sphere itself emerged from the private realms of, say, the British coffee houses or the French salons, where thanks to an increase in critical journalism and greater access to literature, members of the public were beginning to have critical debate on matters of the state. So the sphere mediated between the sphere of the state and the sphere of the people. And one key element for the sphere to emerge is that public opinion has to be formed in an open and deliberative way. So the question then remains, can we then expand this public sphere to involve the virtual realm of these online platforms for participation? And so for this to occur, there's obviously a number of requirements that have to take place for this to happen. I won't go through them now, but they have to consider both online and offline related resources to allow for this form of knowledge co-production to occur. And to fill out these requirements, I've started to develop a list of recommendations that I feel could be followed and could be applied to these online platforms. So again, apologies for the long list, but I think they're all rather important. So these are a number of recommendations that I feel, if applied to the online platforms, would allow for a form of enhanced deliberation to occur, and then therefore for a form of collective intelligence to emerge from this deliberation itself. And so they include things like producing guidelines on how to have positive debate, how to take time with your responses, or even to things such as limiting the number of posts someone can make to ensure that a particular user is not swamped by a super user itself as well. But, and I'm afraid there's always a but in this as well, and perhaps the most important message to take home, and one that I wanted to emphasize, is even after all these recommendations or technological changes that can be made to these systems, it's the user that remains the most positive or the most critical part of this innovation network as well. So the online platforms themselves can be influenced or entrenched by our social and cultural norms which plague the contemporary society today. And then in that sense, that the issues that we've discussed earlier become more and more apparent. And the technological innovations themselves become sort of embedded into this mundane society as well. To combat that then, luckily what I feel is the best action is the very practice of deliberation itself to break through these cultural norms and these societal norms as well. So for this to happen, as mentioned in the talk earlier, it requires significant intervention, funding and support from both members of the government and non-government to develop these platforms of deliberation to encourage this change as well. So that was a whistle-stop tour of my PhD. Sorry, if any questions, please come and talk to me afterwards as well. Thank you.